last June, I rejoined the FCC to assist in writing the National Broadband Plan, and at that time, Congress had one-third of the time that Congress had allotted to write the plan had already passed. There was no staff dedicated to its completion, and there was no budget. But I wanted to say that I expect no sympathy, because in Silicon Valley, where we basically are project short on time, people and money are standard protocol, and more importantly, the plan did have two assets that every VC would recognize as the most important for any startup, which was a great mission and a thick stack of resumes of people willing to work long hours for low pay. And I just want to mention one of whom just walked in and who's a graduate of this institution, Phoebe Young, who did an extraordinary amount of work on this, served as our general counsel, was the one who gave kind of the last read and edit of this thing, contributed in a lot of different ways. You should not, by the way, blame her for any typos. Putting together this document was a very arduous experience, and we did find a few that'll be in the next version, or probably on the electronic version, or corrected by now. But it's a real tribute to Stanford if they continue to produce people like that. There were also hundreds of others at the FCC who helped contribute to the plan, and as we started planning it, we started to recognize that we faced three challenges. The first was to, of course, just meet the congressional directive. It's very unusual for Congress to ask an agency for a plan. It's even more unusual for Congress to ask an agency for a plan that implicates a lot of activities outside the normal jurisdiction of that agency. But in this case, Congress did so, and with good reason. Broadband networks are not valuable in and of themselves. They derive their value from how we use them. So Congress asked for a plan that not only outlined how to bring broadband to every American, I'll talk about that in a second, since Greg maybe doesn't think we should bring it to all of rural America, but also to set out how to use broadband to advance a series of national priorities, including education, healthcare, energy efficiency, job training, public safety, among others. So that's a really broad mandate, one we could have addressed in a number of ways. Some suggested that the plan should stay at a very high level of principle, shying away from controversy, and limiting its recommendations to platitudes that everyone would applaud. In the long term, we don't think that that would have resulted in the kind of plan Congress wanted or that the country needed. So instead, we made a series of concrete recommendations that are already setting the gears of government into action. There are over 60 new rulemakings at the FCC. Several bills are being drafted for Congress, and there has already been an establishment of an interagency implementation group out of the White House. But to determine those recommendations and ultimately execute them, we also needed to confront a second challenge, which was transforming the FCC, particularly in the area of how it thinks about data. We had to collect and present data completely differently than had been done, including by being candid about the data that we had and how it was deeply flawed. Instead of just gathering data and being the sole source of analysis, we also needed to become a platform for data gathering to enable a broader community to analyze its implications, which is part of what we're doing and what Derek was talking about in terms of transparency. Instead of announcing a decision at the end of a process, we needed to publicly discuss throughout the process the key data, points and issues, and the direction of our thinking, which we did by coming to every FCC meeting in the 9 months that we were doing this and saying, here's where we are. If we're wrong about this, please tell us. And instead of just discussing those issues behind closed doors with selected lobbyists, we needed an open debate in public. We needed input from a wide array of interests. We needed to hear more about technology and economics and less about politics. We did all those things in a series of workshops and field hearings. But here, too, we quickly started to realize that that transformation would not be sufficient unless we confronted a third challenge, the need to galvanize activity beyond the FCC. Problems like adoption, connecting anchor institutions, transparency can only be successfully addressed if there were organized non-FCC groups focused on that long-term mission. And since the plan was released, we've seen a number of these groups spring up, a public-private nonprofit partnership to promote adoption by older adults, another to make discounted equipment, service, and training available to low-income Americans, a coalition to provide broadband tools to small businesses, a contest to develop broadband applications with certain social purposes, a consortium developing creative ways to upgrade institutional connectivity to community anchor institutions. So meeting all three of these challenges was critical, and if we hadn't met them all, the long-term prospects for the plan would have been nil. But the most important and the most daunting challenge still looms. And I'm going to spend the balance of my time today talking about this fourth challenge, how to realize the transformational power of broadband. Now, in some ways, this is a task tailor-made for the United States. We've proven time and time again that we know how to invest and seize the future, as with railroads and electricity in the 1800s and highways and communications network in the 1900s. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of this country over the past 2 centuries is the way we embrace the future. And when Derek was talking about the Google Gigabit initiative and the 1,100 communities that responded to it, it's funny, he stole some thoughts of mine that I'm now going to steal back from him, because I was speaking about this the other day at Google. It really, in my mind, to have, if in 1910 we had suddenly seen 1,100 communities say, we want an 8-lane highway connecting our communities, everyone would have thought these people were nuts, because there weren't gas stations, there weren't cars that most people drove. So in the same way, it's not at all clear what a gigabit connection can do. The use case for it is not at all established. But I think, in my own analysis of what Google did, and we're very, very pleased that they did that, it really shows something. This really is about how Americans, A, love the future, and B, understand that the future is a broadband-enabled future. And yet, ironically, one of the key findings of our planning process was that as a country, particularly in key sectors, we have not embraced broadband. In nearly every metric used to measure the adoption of health information, the U.S. ranks in the bottom half among comparable countries, even though electronic health records could save more than $500 billion in 15 years. Much of the electric grid is not connected to broadband, even though a smart grid could prevent 360 metric tons of carbon emissions by 2030. In education, online courses have been shown to dramatically reduce the time required to learn a subject and greatly increase course completion, and yet we are not utilizing tools in education the way we should. And nearly a decade after 9/11, our first responders still don't have access to the communications that broadband would enable. So why are we having a problem capturing this opportunity? One answer can be found in a paper that I think was written here at Stanford in 1990. Economics historian Paul David wrote a paper called The Dynamo in the Computer, which explored why major innovations in microelectronics, fiber optic communications, and computing had not yet shown up in the productivity statistics. He cited a couple reasons, but the most important for right now is what he called a diffusion lag, that it takes time for one technical system to replace another. But it's not just a matter of technology. It took about 40 years for 50% of the factories to connect to the electric grid after the first central power station opened. And part of the reason was the owners of the factory said, why do we need to invest in electricity when we've already built factories that use water power? And indeed, everyone who had ever designed a factory knew how to do it for water power. So you had to have this enormous change, and furthermore, it wasn't profitable to change it because, as the paper points out, production technologies adopted to the old regime of mechanical power derived from water and power, it would not be profitable to simply replace them with new ones. In other words, the problem wasn't simply getting electricity. It was overcoming the cost of re-engineering factories and the processes and indeed the whole ecosystem to benefit from electric power. And so in the plan, we learned that certain sectors face very significant obstacles in re-engineering processes to fully realize the benefits of broadband. Now, it could be that time, of course, will correct the problem, but we need to recognize the enormous cost, potential cost, and one can look at that cost by looking back at the 1997 business classic, The Innovator's Dilemma, which examined the difficulties large companies have in innovating. One of the patterns pointed to in the book is how well-established companies develop their systems to efficiently meet their customers' current demands. Again, Derek was talking about how people in 1910 might have said what they wanted were faster horses, not realizing the transformative power of cars. So reluctant to capitalize on their own products, companies are late to employ new, more efficient, radically different approaches to meeting their clients' needs.